Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. I am the motion picture analyst, and this is a commentary track for the 1941 masterpiece version of The Maltese Falcon, produced by Warner Brothers and written and directed in his directorial debut by the legend himself, John Huston. This was the third attempt by Warner Brothers to adapt Dashiell Hammett's literary masterwork from 1930, and while the previous two adaptations each have their own fans and their own unique identities, neither one truly achieved what Hammett had intended in his 1930 novel, and it was a combination of factors that led John Huston to approach this property for his directorial debut at Warner Brothers after his success as a screenwriter. As always, these will be my own comments, thoughts, and bits of production history and anecdotes that come to mind as the film unfolds. Please do bear with me. As always, these are not professionally recorded commentaries, and so if anything arises, do keep that in mind. So if you wish to view the film along with this commentary, go to whichever version of the film you wish to play along with, and go ahead and cue it up to the 0-minute, 0-second mark, somewhere in the black area before the Warner shield appears, and we'll do a brief count-in. Again, as these are not professionally recorded, we should be in roughly the same spot, but you should be able to follow along with me in any case. So go ahead and go to your copy of the film now, and we will do a brief count-in. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, press play now. And we find ourselves on the Warner shield with the iconic fanfare, which will then quickly transition into the haunting strains of Adolf Deutsch's score for the Maltese Falcon, which gives us the first instance of this theme, which will run throughout the picture and form the bulk of his very striking score. And now we see our main cast list come up as the music fades off into this very melancholy, mysterious rendition of this same theme, as we see the big names come up of Hal B. Wallace, Henry Blanke, who was a great help to John Huston on this film, is really the secret weapon, and then the all-important screenplay by John Huston, based on the novel by Dashiell Hammett, the cinematography credit for Arthur Edison, who was an incredible collaborator with Huston on this film, which really makes it a contemporary of Citizen Kane in more ways than one, and directed by John Huston, who also came up with this opening text scroll, which has nothing to do with Dashiell Hammett's original novel and gives us a little bit of background about the Falcon to start things off. But for those seeing the film for the first time, this is just a beautiful piece of adventure and mystery and just giving wonderful color and texture to the fate of the Black Bird, who we will find more out about in the rest of the film. And then we go into the least typical part of the film, this opening cue for this music giving us footage of San Francisco, seemingly cobbled together out of some pre-existing footage and other things. And then after that brief little burst of energy, we come into the office of Spade and Archer and see Samuel Spade for the first time, basically recreating the opening pages of Dashiell Hammett's novel, but also giving us Bogart as the iconic Sam Spade, Lee Patrick as Effie Perrin, the wonderful secretary, basically one of the first in a long line of Moneypenny type secretaries, who is, of course, the most wholesome character in the film, and we are introduced to Mary Astor as the first of her aliases, Miss Wonderly, but of course, ultimately revealed to be Bridget O'Shaughnessy. Now, of course, this is exactly how Dashiell Hammett's novel opens, but Hammett's legendary, very direct prose style already is infused into this film, while Huston kept the vast majority of Hammett's prose intact. Obviously, you can't keep descriptive terms in this world of cinema. So if you're looking at this film, and especially if you've ever seen the previous two films, such as the 1931 Pre-Code adaptation, you'll note that this film already has a different sort of visual style to it to either the 1931 or 1936 previous Falcon adaptations or other films of the period. You'll note there's a sense of playing with the depth of shadow, playing with the grayscale, and also using a sense of depth to increase the drama of each individual scene. Each shot has an identity. And this, again, is what I was alluding to earlier. It's really the partnership between John Huston and Arthur Edison, who is one of the great cameramen of cinema. And the Maltese Falcon doesn't get enough credit for being a real contemporary of Citizen Kane's, and you'll see this throughout. it uses the cinematic medium and the design of every shot to accentuate the actors' performances, but also bring Hamlet's prose to life by giving it the same energy and a visual sense, even something as simple as Miles Archer coming in the doorway there. Of course, Miles Archer is played by Jerome Cowan, who appeared at the end of Bogart's last major film for Warner's, his first real film that was a breakthrough, which was High Sierra, where Cowan appeared at the end, and ironically, he only appears at the beginning of The Maltese Falcon, which was the film that cemented Bogart's stardom. Of course, John Huston wrote High Sierra, and that's what he really strove to replicate here. Is he really wrote High Sierra with Bogart in mind and started to learn the actor's sensibilities, and it was on this film, The Maltese Falcon, that they became lifelong friends. And you really can't escape the sort of spirit of High Sierra leaching into this version of the Falcon, because John Huston always prided himself on trying to maintain the spirit of the author's original work. But Huston's great talent in all of the adaptations he did, in particular The Maltese Falcon most of all, but again felt in High Sierra and The Asphalt Jungle or The Treasure of the Sierra Madre as well, is that while he would keep the vast majority of the original text, he had to find ways to, of course, bring it into the cinematic medium, but he also found ways to distill certain things, to clear up a little bit of narrative confusion here and there, to streamline things a little bit, to play better in a cinematic form, but also to make the overall themes more clear. That's part of the reason why every character in the 1941 version of The Maltese Falcon is so vivid in the mind's eye, and that's what people remember most, are the characters all searching for the black bird. Huston's adaptation, rather interestingly, in small minor changes and tweaks, mostly to deal with the confines of the production code at the time, managed to really distill all of Hamlet's themes, and we have roughly, I'd say, about 90 to 95% of Hamlet's dialogue word for word, with some tweaks and subtractions and some line readings a little bit different. But in the process of doing this, Huston actually makes all of the characters just a little bit more mythic. They seem just a little bit larger than life, whereas in Hamlet, they have in the novel there's a little bit more roughness to them. But we associate so much more with these characters because they represent ideals. But there's also an undercurrent of Huston's humor, such as here in The Killing of Miles Archer, one of the most iconic killings in cinema, where we see next to nothing and the gun almost lazily rises up because someone has been waiting there. And we know it's someone that Archer knows of, or almost knows of, because he seems to recognize them at first in the darkness. It's not only a striking visual, but also has an undercurrent of humor, again, and also a level of darkness, because it's so anonymous. And then we immediately cut to the phone ringing here, with the windows open and the light wind of the late evening, early morning, the wee hours blowing through. And we don't even see Spade answering the phone. It's some time before Bogart actually comes into frame, and we hold on this singular image before the camera starts to pull back. That's something you really wouldn't see in other films. So again, everything Huston and Edison are doing here visually is to convey the spirit of the scene, but also not make it so overwhelming for the actors, to allow the actors enough breathing room to also drive the scene. So the actors serve the visuals and the visuals serve the actors, and thus every single shot in this film is meticulously designed, but also able to still live and breathe and essentially make it feel as if these events are playing out in reality. Also due to the focus on literally trying to have more of a deep focus style technique, although that was never expressly stated, that was what they were going for, and you'll notice that throughout the film. It really makes the audience an active participant. The audience themselves goes along with Spade. Even though we are seeing Spade here, we still have that sort of viewpoint as if we were right there. And also, interestingly, The Killing of Archer is the only scene in the film that does not actually feature Spade in it. So that is the one sort of outlier in the entire film. Spade is literally making his way through the world as an outsider. As we see here, he can't even get through the little police blockade without having to explain his business. So even here at the outset, we see Spade as the outsider. He looks down over all the police crew down there looking at the body of his partner, who, of course, he's not really torn up about getting shot because, as we later learn in the dialogue, he didn't like him anyway. So there's a callousness to Spade. I know Roger Ebert once wrote that Spade is as cold and hard as his name, and it's absolutely true in certain ways. It's part of the armor that he has to wear. But we also see that he's an intelligent man. He's also a cut above the usual sort of private detective. He's also shown to be more intelligent and having greater reasoning than the police, as here he's able to suss out the exact events of the murder, right down to being able to correctly identify the gun as a Webley. And in the background there is one of the all-time great in-jokes in all of cinema. You'll see a poster on the wall there for the Warner's film Swing Your Lady, which was a hillbilly musical, which also featured Humphrey Bogart, which he referenced as probably the worst film he ever made. It was one of the Warner Brothers films he was forced to be in his contract days. That started with The Petrified Forest, which was a great breakout for him. It wasn't really until John Huston's screenplay and Raoul Walsh's direction of High Sierra that you really saw the Bogart that we know and love start to emerge. And then the Maltese Falcon is what cemented that. Of course, we have Ward Bond here as Tom Polhouse, who is Sam's only potential friend on the force. And even though Tom has very few scenes, just like Effie, who's on the phone here with Spade, we know all we need to know about these characters just from the nuances of the performance and the maintaining of Hammett's dialogue. It's remarkable how every character in this film not only has a mythic quality, but we know everything we need to know about them. We know who these people are. We know them so much so that we can't think of these characters without thinking of the 1941 film versions. And it's even to the smallest degree, the smallest characters and the smallest bits of business and dialogue. Even the set design is lived in and more detailed than usual. And if you know films of this time period, you will already be noticing something that is quite unique, which of course are the visible ceilings. That is another common thing that this has with Citizen Kane. It's ironic that both Kane and the Maltese Falcon were made at the same time in the same year, and featured a lot of the same innovations and a lot of the same thoughts and ideas, and were, of course, the first directorial efforts of both Orson Welles and John Huston, who became lifelong friends. So it's fascinating to look at both of these films and see how they traveled the same pathways at the same time without really being conscious of the other. This extends to the photography, to the realism, to the usage of different camera angles, to the usage of realistic lighting, which we see here. That's another unique element that you see here in the Falcon that is atypical of films of this period. There's no overhead lighting. You see everything here is lit by natural lighting. We see lamps, and the illumination is coming from the lamps. And we see shadows thrown on the walls, and things are a bit gritty. And once again, the window is still open because it must be a hot night. And again, the way the staging is here of our two police officers, of course, played by Ward Bond, and Barton McLean as Dundee, of course, was very remarkable as a heavy, and High Sierra as well, and was a chief heavy of the Warner Brothers gangster cycle that Bogart graduated from. If you look at the way all of these shots are staged, every single shot is meant to have them dominating the scene because they are the ones coming in here and accusing Spade of something. Every single shot in this film is so meticulously designed. Most people don't give Huston the credit for it, but he did actually storyboard every single shot. He did pour enormous energy and effort, as this was his first film as a director. But if you look at this film in the same way you would Citizen Kane, you'll see that it's, quite frankly, just as meticulously put together. But there's also a certain quality of looseness in terms of, again, this quality of allowing the actors to play the scene and supporting them, and knowing that you've cast the right people and that you're striving as a team to achieve results. And another link with Kane is there are a lot of playing it in one, as it's always termed. There's a lot of long takes, and there's a lot of allowing the passage of time to go along with the performances. There's not a lot of cross-cutting, and when a cut is there, it is as if it was punctuation in a novel. So there is always that literary sense and trying to maintain Hammett's pacing and rhythm, but with those extra flourishes Huston added, such as here of taking the success to crime line and giving that dark tinge of humor. Again, there's a little bit of that in Hammett, but Hammett has more of a slight rawness, and it's also a little bit darker in some of the story elements being made much more obvious, whereas in the film, they're obviously there if you want to read into them. But again, this quality of making the characters a little bit more mythic, making the ideas of Hammett come across a little more, is what you get in the film. And that's the real genius of Huston's adaptation. Again, here's another beautiful shot of depth with Iva Archer opening the door and seeing Spade and Effie at her desk before he goes in and closes the door. And notice how he walks in like a condemned man, because he wants nothing to do with this woman. It's so beautifully obvious, even in the way Bogart delivers his lines. It cannot be overstated how this is the first true appearance of the iconic Bogart we know and love. This is one of the great examples of the right performer finding the right role and the right script and the right director, because everything perfectly gels here. And he is not the physical description that Hammett wrote of, but he so perfectly embodies the character Hammett created, and the spirit of the material. Even these small movements, when he flashes his lip there and then takes his hat off and gives that little look, it allows the audience to live there in that moment, to feel that emotion. And then how he takes her by the shoulders and makes all these reactions and grimaces where she can't see him. And it's interesting what Gladys George does here as Iva, how she gives across the sense of somebody we ourselves would not really want to get involved with. We get a sense of who this character is, and she only has a few short scenes, and it's quite remarkable. It's a very different bit than a part she would play in the Roaring Twenties before this. And we get the nice ghostly shot of Miles Archer's desk, and we see Spade's slight tinge of nonchalance and the tinge of humor that he tries to maintain. And Effie effortlessly grabs the tobacco pouch, lights it, rolls his cigarette for him. We have this nice interaction between the two as real friends. And of course, as in the classic Moneypenny dynamic, it's of course Spade who should marry Effie because she is the best person in this story. She's the only truly pure-hearted, so-called normal person. But that's also the distance between them, that Spade is an outsider. Spade has to travel the mean streets that Raymond Chandler wrote about, but also he's one of the only men who can do that. And it's that distance from reality that we see even here between the two as they're staged in these individual shots. She can have some of his humor, she can get his humor, but she doesn't fully get who Spade is as a person. Hammett wrote of this dynamic, but here it's maintained and built up even further in their interactions and in the visual staging, and how their relationship continues on a certain keel for the rest of the story, despite the various twists and turns of the narrative. And then by the end, they both realize that they can only continue as best they know how. There's a little added flourish of danger here as Spade, of course, burns the address that was just written down. That's always a nice classical element of mystery or suspense stories, of having to burn the information so it can't be discovered. So now we're introduced to Bridget's next sort of performance. Mary Astor doesn't really get enough credit, I think, for her incredible performance in The Falcon, because Bridget O'Shaughnessy is an incredibly difficult role to play. It's really, honestly, it's a forerunner of some of the stuff you see with Phyllis Dietrichson in Double Indemnity, the Barbara Stanwyck role, because both of these roles are all about putting on airs and performing to get what you want out of an individual. And you see here that she tries different things on Spade, and Spade sees right through it. And that's the attraction. That's the light that comes up in Bogart's eyes and the character. That's what interests the character. He knows she's up to no good, but it doesn't seem like she's truly a bad person. But she's intelligent and she moves through the various aspects of those same worlds that Spade does. So she is someone of his type, and that's the real instigation of their connection. Of course, Spade is able to suss out by the end that his initial reading wasn't quite correct. His suspicions of her were true, but he has to follow that trail all the way to the conclusion, and then also stick by his moral code, which is what his entire life is defined by. Also, look at this set here. We have a sense of depth. We have the actors moving around. We have longer takes that allow them to move around aspects of the room. And again, you get this lived-in quality because it seems like a real place. We have light coming in through the open blinds. It's starting to get later in the day. The actual way they move around, and then we see Bridget sit down here and she starts to put on the pleading voice, and we get a close-up that's just adding that extra tinge, so that if you're in the audience and you don't quite get that she's trying to put one on over him, we get into what it would be a more traditional Hollywood close-up, immediately cut to Bogart's "you're good" and the throb you get in your voice. The emphasis that he puts on those lines of dialogue, and then the way that Mary Astor cuts down her emotions and starts to internalize, to put on this sort of victim act. She's trying another tack. That's what Bridget is doing here. So this is really a dance between these two characters, and this is their relationship. This is what involves them with each other, and Spade is fascinated. He's never quite met someone like Bridget O'Shaughnessy. And of course, what draws him in further is the fact that she gives him multiple different names and aliases and never gives him the truth. What's also fascinating here is if you look at just the direction of this scene, when Bridget is delivering these lines, she's propped up against the couch. She's not moving around anymore. It's all suggestive of this is some of the truth leaking out or coming out a little bit. It may not be the entire truth, and she's trying different tacks still, but there's elements that are starting to seep out, and you, the audience, along with Spade, have to choose for yourself what you believe in, or if you don't believe any of it. But again, there isn't a moment of this film that is wasted. Even in little moments you remember, such as Bogart fingering his lip here, which may be a precursor of the famous earlobe tug that he does as Marlowe in the Howard Hawks version of The Big Sleep. But again, if you notice, the cuts are only real punctuations. It allows for these moments to breathe. And again, every single shot, even over the couch here, we can see into the room beyond with the bed and the clothes piled up. It looks like a real place. It looks like you're standing right over Spade's shoulder looking at them. And this moment here when she does the "I don't know" and she kind of looks over, that's where she tips her hand too much. And that's when Spade throws in the towel and tries to throw it right back at her, and that's what concludes this scene. It's a dance to a point of which they reach that end point where they're not going to go any further at this point. Spade knows he's not going to get any more information out of her now until he digs up something else and goes further down the rabbit hole, essentially. Again, even the camera movements and the inserts, the way they are timed, feels so incredibly natural. It's almost timed to the actual attention span of the audience and allowing the right amount of time for the wheels to turn in your head, because again, you are following along with Spade. It never quite does the first-person camera technique that was tried by Robert Montgomery when he adapted Chandler's The Lady in the Lake later on in the decade, and that rather famously didn't quite work. It was viewed as more of a sort of failed experiment. It has interesting moments, but subjective camera is always a very difficult thing to pull off, but it's fascinating to look here in the Maltese Falcon that we have elements of that, but it never overplays its hand never becomes obvious. It's very subjective, almost to the point with the staging giving a sense of depth all the time. It almost gives the sense of when you look at the classic, beautifully made 3D films of the 1950s, which were about creating the sense of depth. If you look at Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder, or even, of course, once again, Citizen Kane, you can't overstate this connection between the two. There is a synergy between the Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane. While they're not doing the deep focus technique that Greg Toland pioneered and having to step the camera down and have the intensive lighting, they are doing a version of that. It's almost the Warner's version, because there's a great sense of the Warner Studio style here. It's probably, it may very well be the signature Warner Brothers film, but it's also not a Warner Brothers film because it's John Huston. It's John Huston's energy, and it's John Huston's energy playing off of what Hammett put down on the page. And now we are introduced to another of the great characters in cinema, Peter Lorre as Joel Cairo, who takes the character from Hammett and the character that John Huston strengthened a little and turns him into one of the most fascinating characters who, in actuality, doesn't have the most screen time, but is equally menacing as he is here in this scene, also pitiable, also simultaneously frightening in some aspects. And then here we have one of the famous low-angle shots of the film, which suggests the cane as this incredible phallic image, as Lorre almost puts it in his mouth. It's this toying with this cane, and combined with this camera angle, and all of these intensive, subtle notes that Lorre is playing that make this such a larger-than-life character. And the way that Bogart reacts and plays off of it, he's fascinated. And of course, Lorre and Bogart will become lifelong friends and adored being able to play off of each other in films. And I think you can pick up on this energy even here. There's a lot of relationships that start in a creative sense on this film. And they went into lifelong friendships. The entire cast was very, very close. And just like on Citizen Kane, they sort of acted like their own company and would frequently pull practical jokes or band together to do things to keep people from coming on the set. All of these things you read about Citizen Kane, or being able to complete really complicated camera setups and shoot a lot of footage because they're doing it all in one and get done at an early time, which of course was atypical of the system. Again, an incredible usage of low angle, never overplaying it, but really suggesting the internal menace that Spade has, this sort of constant simmering anger that his outer shell and his intelligence keep in check. We see little flashes of it, but then we go right into his digging through Cairo's pockets, and we get a classic detective moment of going through bits of evidence, and we see Cairo's a well-traveled man, and we start to learn more about this mysterious character who carries the gardenia-scented cards, and that is the little telltale sign that they are using to suggest what Hammett makes a bit more explicit in his novel, that this is a gay character, which of course you could not do under the production code, but he is coded that way. And so we have the handkerchief also scented as well. But importantly, we have the ticket for the Geary Theater already being seen, which sets up that this man is a theater goer and very cultured. Of course, we already know that from his walking stick, his mannerisms, his gloves, and the beautiful way that Peter Lorre recovers after being punched. And Cairo goes over to the mirror and complains about his shirt. So he has that wonderful slight fussiness to his behaviors. He has all these little mannerisms. And in one sense, you could almost read a little bit of Peter Lorre's iconic Mr. Moto characterization in certain aspects of Cairo. And then here we have the inherent humor come back with the, why should I sit here and let somebody stick me up? The whole rationale Spade gives for messing up Cairo's shirts. It's two beautiful schools of acting here. Every scene in this film is a masterclass of interaction. It doesn't matter what their style of acting is. Every single person on screen has a vitality, And this is really, I think, fueled by the atmosphere Houston generated, and of course enhanced by the incredible visuals, the lovely score motif that keeps popping up. That is also very minimized, as Houston was not a fan of what we now term musical wallpaper. If you look at all his films, the music comes in when it's necessary. It's very strong, but frequently there is no music, and that really starts here on the Maltese Falcon. But again, here, even this shot, we have the window in the background, we have the lights from the cityscape outside, we have the sense of the passage of time. This scene is taking place at night because Spade sent Effie home, and that's when Cairo decided to search his offices because they were now alone and it was late at night. You can again see the wheels turning in the characters' heads. You can see the duplicity of Cairo when he pulls his gun again, and the inherent humor of the situation, and that Spade is an intelligent man enough to realize the just blatant humor of this, and that he's not going to get anything out of resisting, so he just lets them do it anyway. And then in this little transition here, we have a pickup of music. We get our introduction to Elisha Cook Jr. as the immortal Wilmer Cook. But also we get this incredible sense of the job is the life. There is a continual sense of being worn down by day-to-day existence. And we see Spade knowing the tools of the trade as he realizes he's picked up a tail and he's stopped off to do a side eye and then immediately hail a cab because he's now having to shake a tail. But he knows something is up because suddenly he's being tailed by somebody who doesn't seem particularly very good at tailing someone. But someone who already exudes an incredible amount of menace just from the way he cuts through a crowd and just gets bumped by everyone, and of course keeps his hands in his pockets where he's got two bulging .45s. Here again is coming up a little bit more of the humor of the film, because this is a dangerous, suspenseful little scene of Spade having to elude the tail as he's going to Bridget's apartment. But here, the music even picks up the humor of making Wilmer look like the bit of a chump that he really is. And Spade even has a little bit of a smile. That scene is, I think, a real representation of this additional sort of, it's a sort of whimsy almost. It's very morbid at times, but it's another sign of the characters having a slightly more mythic quality. In the novel, they're a little bit, there's a quality, it's a little bit rawer, it's a little bit rougher, it's a little bit more directly connected to the hard-boiled school of fiction and the pulp magazines, of which Hammett was the main author who started the trend of actually getting his work published. And the Maltese Falcon did originally appear in Black Mask first as a serialized story before it was turned into the novel in 1930. Now, again, we have the same exact apartment set here, and look at how different it looks. Suddenly we're a lot closer, the fireplace is lit, it's dark outside, and you can even see the sort of tickling of the firelight on their faces playing with them. And you can also see how this adds a context to the scene, because every scene in this film has a different context once you know the ending. This film practically begs for repeat viewings. You are able to see every single nuance of every single character by the second viewing, by the third viewing, by the fourth viewing. It's a film that never gives up all its secrets at first, which again is like Citizen Kane. They really are joined at the hip in a lot of ways. But the Maltese Falcon has a unique energy. It has this fusion of Dashiell Hammett's spirit with John Huston's style and Huston's incredible ability to recognize phenomenal, incredible material and get to the core of it, and also be able to really make that live and breathe on the screen. And I can never get over how incredibly well Huston worked with Arthur Edison, who had shot many iconic, legendary films before this point, and had also worked with James Whale on several of the Universal horror classics. And so he knew how to work with a great visual just genius And, of course, after the Falcon, he would go on to actually shoot Casablanca with Michael Curtiz. So there is a visual sort of unity in certain ways between the Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, but the Maltese Falcon has this attention to depth in every single shot, which picks up all of the attention paid to costumes and set design and the actual set dressing. And again, the use of practical lighting and the overhead ceilings. And all of this is not done just to be flashy or to show off, as Citizen Kane has so often been accused of being. Just like Citizen Kane, this is all done to enhance each individual scene and each individual moment and the emotions of the scene. And so when the characters move around, it's not that they're moving around in a set, they're moving around in a world. Even the street scenes here, where obviously they are on the Warner backlot, on the iconic Warner City Street sets, with Edison's lighting and the design aesthetic and the fact that we don't have many scenes that are exteriors. They feel like little breaths of fresh air for a brief second, but they're not. We're never seeing a big open sky. We're never walking around in full broad daylight in a long shot. They're still contained. They're still moody. They're still atmospheric, and people move around as they would on the street at night. But they want to hurry up and get where they're going. And then they come in the room and they have to turn all the lights on. And they do this, and Spade immediately catches Wilmer outside. So he knows that they are being watched. And we see how he carries this nonchalantly, and he won't reveal Wilmer's presence for an additional period of time. It is, of course, Cairo coming in, who has to reveal it in his absolutely amazing way. And again, the energy of the room has now changed now that Cairo has entered. And we can sense, without one word of dialogue, that these two have a history. And we see that Bridget's entire demeanor has changed. We have not seen her like this before, and we, just as Spade does, he moves into the center of the frame as the camera starts to move in. We see a different side of these people, and only then, when we get close up on Spade, do we cut in closer to a different angle. Again, that feeling of it being like punctuation. Every single cut is absolutely spot on, and so much so that you don't even feel the image changes. Everything has such a natural flow and feels so right that none of this is visible unless you're actively studying the film. And once again, every reverse angle is all built around depth. There is not one wasted frame or shot. And every single one of these shots, again, is built around the natural lighting, but literally around these two lamps. One lamp on the far side and one lamp just over Cairo. And by having the scene here in Spade's apartment and by getting the geography of it, this allows you to know exactly how they're going to move around in the finale of the film. This is almost a sort of dry run for the finale. We're starting to get the long takes in Spade's apartment. This is another scene in Spade's apartment after him being questioned by the police. And, you know, the film is, of course, mostly dialogue scenes and interiors. So it could be extraordinarily boring. This is a good example of why this film succeeds, where the past two versions didn't quite get there. Even the 1931 version, when it used Hammett's dialogue and it used almost the majority of the Maltese Falcon story, it didn't quite have Hammett's tone. It also altered the ending and also really doubled down on the pre-code elements. So if you compare this same scene of Tom and Dundee coming up to Spade's apartment after they've been called by Iva Archer and told they'll find out something. If you compare this scene here in the 1941 version to the 1931 pre-code version, which is a good scene, and that is a good film, it is quite underrated, but this particular scene does not have any of the menace or the danger, or it doesn't convey the sense that Spade is on thin ice, that he is walking a tightrope walk, and if he makes any slight wrong move, he himself will be blamed for various crimes and unable to continue this case. And again, these shots, as they reverse back and forth, the cutting is punctuated just right, and always to show the two police figures in a level of authority. They're dressed in all black. They have that ominous presence. And you can see even in Tom Polhouse's reactions, what Ward Bond is doing shows that he hopes Sam knows what he's doing, as he says repeatedly throughout the film. He has no dialogue in these shots, but you get the entire sense of the character. And then when we hear the noises, they react. Then we move from that scene. We do not cut until they open the door. There is an incredible maintaining of individual shots for as long as possible to keep this natural quality. And once again, we have a full visible ceiling with overhead visible lighting the scene, and all these incredible shadows are thrown up on the walls. And here we get the first bit of Laurie as Cairo having a little bit of histrionics. And it's just so wonderfully entertaining how he can suddenly go up to level 20 and sort of be this little ball of energy. And it just adds so much to his character. Again, Spade sits down and now is turning on the charm and the humor a little bit. And we're about to have this story that he cooks up. And then we see 4 reaction shots in one with the over the shoulder of Spade sitting down. We have some shots where we move into some closer reaction shots, but in that main shot, as this story plays out, you can see 4 individual reaction shots all at the same time playing out in real time. And each character has a complete about face in this one scene. They start out one way and they end a completely other way in terms of the reaction and where they think their standing is. This, of course, establishes Spade once again as the only man who could move through this particular group of characters and navigate his way through. That is why he is, of course, the one man who will be able to ultimately stand up to all of them. And you know, you'd think that maybe Bridget O'Shaughnessy would realize that she'd bitten off more than she could chew, and this was not merely another Floyd Thursby she could manipulate so easily. Of course, anytime you have Bogart and Barton McLean on the screen, you can't think of the classic Warner Brothers gangster cycle, and of course, the scenes they had shared together in High Sierra just before this. So you can't overlook the connection to the classic Warner gangster films, how that sort of permeates the Maltese Falcon, but in a good way. It has the echoes of the 30s gangster cycle, which had, you know, run into the furor of the production code and become progressively watered down. But Warner did have to do something else that was a bit different. So it made sense that they would come back to the Maltese Falcon for the third time, because I think everybody sort of felt they hadn't quite licked it those first 2 times. Of course, the second film was Satan Met a Lady in 1936, where they made the ill-advised decision to try to mash Hammett into a screwball comedy and do both at the same time. And it is a bizarre film experience. So the fact that film fared so poorly, I think, is why they were more begrudging of a first-time director getting his shot at making a film with a modest budget and schedule. But you know, if he was going to try to do a big A-list property, they probably weren't going to go for that. But doing a story that they owned and had already done twice before, and the last time was 5 years ago, and it didn't do well, so you know that it was a safer bet, so they thought. And they of course got back so much incredibly more than they ever realized they would have. But it was, in the studio's mind, a safer bet to let a first-time director do something that, you know, was a smaller story, mostly interiors, and already been done twice before. Again, there's this beautiful undercurrent of humor between Spade and Bridget, and these are the moments where where their possible romance is at its strongest, and you really start to feel the connection of the two. what's remarkable about Astor's performance is how she can play all these nuances. I've seen a lot of various studies, or people want to just write off the Bridget character as being a bit too simple, and that she's not so as obviously villainous as the sort of typical femme fatale that people think of in film noir. But that's not the point of the character. The characters here, the main characters of Bridget and Spade and Cairo and Gutman and even Wilmer and even Effie are all representative of ideas and ideals and values, and also characters and people and various cases Hammett actually worked on and encountered during his time as a Pinkerton detective. So the reason why Hammett has such an authenticity in all of his work is that he actually lived this stuff, and he did take direct inspiration from a lot of various characters and events that he encountered in his years as a detective, and that only informed his storytelling. So what this humor does also is it actually adds a connection that is a bit more obvious in the novel. At the end of this scene in the novel, it is, pretty much stated that Spade actually sleeps with Bridget O'Shaughnessy and that they do consummate their relationship. Here we almost go into a kiss, and then we get this nice, ominous, almost eerie glance out the windows. The camera moves into the drapes, and we see Wilmer with a slight eerie tinge of the soundtrack. But what we don't have, the major omission that a lot of people like to highlight from the novel, besides the ending, is the Flitcraft story. Spade suddenly tells Bridget this parable about a man he was tasked to track down once, and I think there are really two reasons why Huston cut it, because it's really the major thing that he cut outside of tightening a few things later on, which I'll get to. This parable tells of a man that disappeared one day, literally just left his office in the middle of the day and never came back. And then somebody thinks that he saw somebody similar looking years later in another town, and Spade tracks him down and gets this story that the man was almost killed by a falling beam. And that freaked him out enough to where he just then left his entire life and left his family provided for, wandered around, and then came back, settled down in another town, and ironically, essentially recreated his original life without realizing it. And the parable is saying that this man had adjusted his life to the notion that a beam could fall down at any moment and kill him. And then when that no longer happened, he readjusted his life to the beam not falling. And it's a fascinating section of the book. It's the one that gets analyzed the most by literary critics. It's very philosophical, but it's also meant to sort of suggest, I think, the inherent moral code of the Spade character and how he has to snap back to that, because that is literally what defines his life and his outlook on life and his existence. And without that, there's not much else. He would be a much emptier character like Wilmer here, who seemingly has little to no emotion and is there merely to carry out the will of his employers unless somebody sets him off, such as that beautiful touch there where Spade is even trying to set him off by blowing the smoke in his face. And all this is another example of Spade being able to move through this world and show his expertise. And now we have another confrontation with Joel Cairo in the wonderful, beautiful setting of the hotel lobby in the morning, except Cairo has just come in from a police grilling. Of course, it only seems like that because it is quite possible that, as is questioned later, that he is merely drawing out that story and has already been furthering the plot with other characters we have not yet met. Or it's just part of Spade's suspicions that are not real. It is a nice little, it's a potential red herring. It's one of the elements of the Falcon that you can actually read in a number of different ways. And it's just how you take the individual scene. I also love the fact that Cairo almost seems like he's hungover at this point. With just that little subtle rubbing of the temples. Spade comes in, Effie's on the phone, and they have their own sign language. That's a beautiful little thing. There's so much eye play and banter between the two. Again, it is an early forerunner of the classic James Bond Moneypenny dynamic of the woman in the office who's almost a motherly or sisterly figure and is a grounding element for our lead character who is moving through this world. This is one of the most famous images from the film. That's one of the stills that frequently gets reprinted of Spade and Bridget in the window, which, of course, as Spade has ordered before, is now actually changed to just Sam Spade. And, of course, Miles's desk has been removed. So even here, we do see the passage of time, and we do get to see the office updated. And, of course, knowing this story, after seeing the film and coming back to it, you can read that scene and understand that Bridget is putting on airs a little bit, but she is actually afraid because her apartment has been broken into and ransacked. Now, this is one element of the story that is it can be a little bit confusing because you have to wonder who actually burglarized her apartment. Obviously looking for the Falcon, which she doesn't have. And originally, it is Spade himself who does this. In the novel, in the morning while she's still asleep, he steals her key and goes and searches the apartment and then ransacks it. This is actually done in the 1931 film version, but here, interestingly, it is one of the elements that Huston drops. I don't know if it was simply for time or he felt he didn't need it, because you can read this as Spade doing it, but it seems more likely that it was Cairo who went and did that after his police grilling, that he somehow found where her apartment was, and that would explain what he was doing. So there are several unanswered little moments that don't actually affect the story, that are a little bit more spelled out in Hammett's novel, but having them unanswered here also furthers the element of mystery. We don't know every single in and out. And here we see a mysterious figure come in, and we don't see who it is at first. And it's only until the voice and Iva comes around the desk, and we're, again, notice, still in the same shot. There was no cut there. So the energy of that scene is maintained from the instant of that first suspense moment where we don't know who it is. And only now do we cut in close when they're actually up against the window. And we see Spade finally using the information that Effie had given him about Iva. And we see how she is playing the scene, and how even she is putting on airs like Bridget, but of course anybody can see through those because she's nowhere near as good of an actress as Bridget O'Shaughnessy is. Which, of course, underlines the whole reason why Spade is so attracted to Bridget O'Shaughnessy and doesn't give a damn about Iva Archer and just wants her gone. And the irony of that whole situation is she thinks he killed her husband for them to be together, and nothing Spade does can convince her otherwise. And for the first time in the film, we see richer, more ornate surroundings, which sets up this beautiful, deep shot through the door, introducing us to another of the most unforgettable characters in all of cinema, Sidney Greenstreet, as Casper Gutman, the Fat Man. And in one of the bits of trivia that will never cease to amaze, this is Sidney Greenstreet's first film role. These are his first scenes in a film. And these scenes are all about eye play and dueling between actors and letting moments hang in the air of every single space around every single word having all kinds of different meanings, and even little gestures speak volumes, such as Gutman flicking out his gigantic suit jacket before he sits down. We start to get the low angles that signify we are in the realm of Casper Gutman, the larger-than-life villain whose mere physical bulk is imposing in these low-angle shots. where Spade knows that he has to tread carefully because while this man seems like the most charming man on earth, he knows the trail of bodies that follows in the wake of this man wherever he goes. There's a tension here, but there's also a delicious sort of twinkle in the eye. There's this incredible mixture of humor and bemusement and sheer menace. That is why Casper Gutman is one of the great villains in all of fiction, because a great villain is a charming villain. Apparently, Greenstreet was so nervous in these scenes, he would even hold Mary Astor's hand before takes because he was so nervous, as this was his first film. Again, that is one of those anecdotes I will never be able to get over because it's such a complete performance in diction, in physical movement, in just the way he holds his gaze with Bogart. And Bogart's naturalism is a sort of, it's a back and forth between the two. And all of these little nuances come to the fore, and you can see two individuals recognize they're equal. So again, these scenes are a dance. And once again, notice how every single shot is about depth and how there's a continual usage of staging elements of the frame, whether it's Casper Gutman's bulk or the background elements or the set dressing or the tray of drinks on the table. And of course, the fireplace and the window and the visible ceilings with the natural lighting. It's just a complete visual tour de force in these scenes when it's just simply two guys talking in a room, which should be the most boring thing in the world. And this is anything but. And what's interesting about this is we actually have the scene broken up into two sections. We get to the point where we think Gutman is going to tell us about the Maltese Falcon, what they're after, and we don't get that. So Spade goes into his sort of mini rant, and Wilmer comes in the room off screen to heighten his entry into this deep frame. And then Spade storms out and yells, but this depriving the audience of explaining what the Maltese Falcon is means we're excited to find out what it is in the next scene because we didn't get that. It's like when you have a song that delays the chorus for another verse. And then Spade comes out and we see his smile and we realize it was all an act, except for the little moment here where he catches that his hand is shaking. And we start to wonder just how much of an act it was as Joel Cairo comes off the other elevator. Although I've always wondered, because the doors close so slowly, you almost think that Spade would have had to have seen Cairo going into Gutman's apartment and knowing that something was up. And again, it begs the question of, is that the point where Cairo reteams with Gutman, or has he already done that? It's a nice little extra element of mystery that keeps the audience guessing. Even when you see the film 100 times, you don't know absolutely everything, so that air of mystery is always there. Now, this scene here is probably the most standard looking of all the scenes in the film, but as you see, it's not standard looking at all. It's an office set here in the DA's office, but here you see the desk is staged in a way. We have all of the characters deep in the frame, and we have the stenographer there up front, and it allows us to get that nice little bit of humor in there to show the just sort of the contempt Spade has for the police and the justice system and how they seemingly just spin their wheels all the time. Because, of course, he is the outsider. He can't stand when things don't work properly. And especially when people don't seem to live by a moral code of any sorts. That's why he enjoys and tries to provoke Wilmer so much, because Wilmer is essentially a cold, empty, remorseless shell of a human being. And he knows the more that he plays him, he can manipulate Wilmer and use that in a confrontation with Gutman, because he knows that he has to have some edge at all times with all of these characters, but especially Gutman most of all. And if he can play Wilmer with humor, he knows that is the thing that will get to Wilmer the most and unnerve him the most and maybe cause Wilmer to snap. So you can see this is all a chess game. And now we come back to Gutman's apartment, and now we're actually going to get the story. So that breaking up of the conversation here, which is something the other two versions didn't necessarily do. They did the Gutman scenes differently, but in some ways they played it straight in more of just one scene. But by breaking these scenes up, it only builds the suspense. And also you can tell that the air in the room has changed. We don't quite know why at first. We think that maybe it's because Spade has proved himself in some way, which he has to Gutman. Gutman knows he's not someone to be trifled with, which is why he's going to drug him to get him out of the way. So we have the same room here. We have the same actors. But again, we feel the passage of time. The lighting has changed outside. Gutman is now in a robe instead of his suit. So we know that he's gotten comfortable, he's enjoying his luxurious hotel room, and that he plans on being in this room for a while because he's not in, street clothes, essentially. But look at the camera angles here. Spade sits down on the couch, but the angles are different. We're not quite going for the low angles yet because Gutman is going to relate this story. So that menace of the first conversation isn't there in the same way. It's being underplayed and dialed down here because now we're getting the fascination of the story of the Blackbird and what the Maltese Falcon actually is. And we're not getting the low angles of Gutman because he is the storyteller. We're hooked on his every single word, just as Spade is. But of course, the first time you see this particular scene, you're just wrapped up in the story. You don't know that Gutman has a specific ulterior motive of getting Spade to take the drugged drink so then they can get him out of the way. That is the reason why he's actually telling Spade the story. And at the same time, it fills the audience in. So it's exposition, but some of the most beautifully handled exposition that has ever been in a film because it's about character and about filling the audience in, and about the sense of adventure and mystery of finding out about this majestic jewel-encrusted falcon, and learning the history of it and what the history of it entails, and how that makes it a lost treasure for the ages and adds to the allure. And you can start to see why these people are so desperate to get this. And you can see this dawning on Spade. But it also explains about Gutman's obsession with the Maltese Falcon, why he spent 17 years of his life looking for this little item, as he later calls it. It's a way of showing his obsession, his mania. And of course, this is really reflective of all mankind's desire for money and power and wealth, which of course may be symbolized in Hamlet's choice of making Casper Gutman a large man and literally naming him Gutman, as in he is sort of engorged in his pursuit of wealth and nothing else. Once again, the actors move around naturally and the camera follows them into beautiful setups. This is the first time in the scene we get that lower angle shot of Gutman. And here we have another one, a little bit closer. But this is starting to let that dominance of Gutman come back into the scene. So as the scene goes on, the back and forth between the two starts to get a little bit one-sided and more. And here Gutman moves closer and gets more of an angle, which gives him that superiority. And Spade is sitting down looking up at him. So as the scene plays on, to the point that Spade actually takes the drink and starts to feel the effects, that's when we know for sure that this whole time, we, the audience, along with Sam Spade, have been manipulated by a master. And the whole time, he's continually offering to top off the drink. He tops off the drink a second time. Now he's doing it again. All done in talking and in these longer shots, which means if the actors flubbed a line or they made a mistake, they had to start all over. That's the danger of doing single takes. But also, if you can pull it off, the energy you create and you maintain throughout, it never dissipates because you're not cutting. This is something that, again, that was done on Citizen Kane. So the idea of trying to do it in one is not just to show off. It's when necessary to create a certain energy that is vital for individual scenes. And Huston was a master of this even at this early stage, which makes the Maltese Falcon, for all of these reasons I discuss in this track, one of the most unbelievably striking directorial debuts in the history of motion pictures. And now here, with Bogart's performance and the first little strains of a music cue, and now the out-of-focus shot of Gutman, this is how we're clued into that Spade has been drugged. And look how Gutman's lines, how Greenstreet starts to modulate, and then he starts to lean in forward. And we know that he has planned this entire time. And then we get the classic bit of not being able to set the glass down and then not being able to walk out on your own power before finally collapsing to the floor. Again, it's all understated, but because it's still being played out in a single shot and we're not breaking it up, it allows this moment to play out. And notice the music never becomes overbearing and has that wonderful slight eerie tinge that Deutsch put in his score in certain moments. And then, just as Wilmer did earlier, Cairo comes in to the left of the frame and we know he's been there the whole time. Gutman pulls off the robe to reveal he's been dressed the whole time. He puts on his hat and they all exit. Now, interestingly, they don't kill Spade. I think that's a measure of Gutman's respect for him because he's slightly amused by Spade in a number of ways, actually. But also, they didn't really need to kill him. They just needed him out of the way because they thought they were picking up the Falcon, and they would then leave town and leave Spade to deal with this mess that they've created. Again, we have a passage of time with the fade out making us really feel it. And then as we fade back in, the room is dark. There's no light coming from outside. And so we're a little disoriented, just like Sam Spade is. So it perfectly conveys the sense of coming to after being, slipped a Mickey and then given a vicious kick as well. And we're allowed to feel this because Spade has to stagger around. He has to basically put himself back into shape, throw cold water on his face, and we see the bruises on his face. And Bogart's performance is allowing to play through these moments and allow us, the audience, to feel that malaise and that anger at oneself for being tricked, too. Which, of course, is, let's do something right for a change. You can sense that anger at oneself. Now here we have a nice little tightening up of an element from Hammett's novel, where it's Spade in the film who discovers the La Paloma on the newspaper clipping, whereas it's a bit more labored in the book. And there's also another side character in the book. One of the other major changes Huston made is in the book, Gutman has a daughter whose only real purpose is to give Spade a particular bit of information, and she does so when she's sort of been drugged up. And then we also have a bit of back and forth of events before we get to the La Paloma. So this little bit right here, this tightening of it, of Spade coming to and finding the La Paloma newspaper listing that Cairo had left in Gutman's apartment, and then immediately going to the La Paloma on fire, tightens up that moment perfectly. And we, the audience, can tell exactly what has happened. That they obviously went to the La Paloma thinking they would recover the bird. Something happened, and now the boat's on fire. So we know they've been there. And in the book, there's a lot more back and forth that, while they're good scenes, this was a good change. That is an example of great adaptation work when there's a particular moment that's a little muddled. And if you can streamline that and tighten it up, you should do so when possible. Because that gets us to this point in the office, where Effie is nicely patching up Spade, and gets us to Captain Jacobi coming in with the Falcon. This, of course, famously is Walter Huston John Huston's famous, legendary actor father, who did this as a sort of good luck charm. And the story goes as a practical joke that John Huston had his father do this take after take, making up various reasons that something went wrong or he didn't fall right, to the point that Huston finally got mad. They all realized he finally realized it was a practical joke. But it's one of the beautiful sort of cameos in films that it's Walter Huston doing this, just coming in as Captain Jacobi, who's been shot to heck back by Wilmer. And we can see Effie's reaction to all of this, that she is a normal person now looking at this guy who managed to walk all this way with like 5 or 6 bullet holes in him. And then after a certain point, then they suddenly realize, oh, hey, didn't he drop something? It takes a while to dawn on them after this intensive burst of action and energy. Hey, wait, what's that on the floor? And fascinatingly, the Falcon is wrapped up in paper with, of course, Chinese writing, because Jacobi brought it from Hong Kong, where he got it from Bridget O'Shaughnessy and Thursby. That's a little thing you don't notice for the longest time, but I so appreciate that little tiny detail that it's wrapped up in newspaper with Chinese writing. And you can see that Spade is so invested in this moment that he doesn't realize how hard he grips Effie's arm. And as Spade has his reaction, you can see the wheels turning in his head just as the phone rings. And it's the evil machinations of the other 3 to get him away, hopefully before Captain Jacobi arrives. But they are, of course, too late. And this is another example of why Effie is a good, kind-hearted, normal person. She immediately falls for Bridget's story, and had she been the one who received the Falcon and gotten the call and Spade hadn't been here, because she's a good person, she would have believed that story on the phone and run out there to try and help, and probably left the Falcon there for them to come and steal back. So, of course, it's Spade who immediately has to err on the side of caution, if you will, and even inform her to leave the story of the bundle out of what she tells the police. And it's Spade who's able to identify it's Captain Jacobi, as if we couldn't already tell. In case we couldn't, it's Spade who does the identifying, which again shows us his prowess as a detective, that he's able to immediately put that together. This is the most beautifully dated moment in the film of being able to go and get a claim ticket for the Falcon and then mail the claim ticket back to oneself. This is just one of the great classical ideas of noir and detective stories. And he even writes just city on the envelope, which is another thing that would definitely get that envelope immediately rejected nowadays by the Postal Service. This is another element. We're back out in the city street at night. This is a wider shot, but we're able to see more of the city life, and we get that feeling of, even though as things are picking up, we get another feeling of the job is the life is the job, and the grind continually goes on. We can see that Spade and the cab driver have a history together, and that this is, not something new for either of them. Now, this is, of course, replicating an event from the book, but it also streamlines it a bit. In the book, we actually meet some people here and find out that it's just a dead end. Here, it's done entirely in visuals with the vacant lot, and also with Spade's reactions and the way the score picks up. There's a slight tinge of humor as well. And in one of the most iconic lines for me of the film, "Bum steer, Mr. Spade." I remember as a kid, I would watch this film over and over, and this is how I learned the phrase bum steer and what that meant. And then Spade throws that back to Effie on the phone here. It was just another bum steer. So I like that there's a sort of commonality even between Sam Spade, ace private detective, and the cab driver. There's a shared sort of experience, even if it's just simple dialect when things don't work out. Now, this is the other telephone call scene in the film that itself is basically a piece of transition, because that gets us to Spade's apartment here. And then as the car pulls off, the camera follows, still in that same shot to reveal Bridget O'Shaughnessy hiding there. And of course, when we see the film after the first time, we know that even this is an act. And this is getting us back into Spade's apartment to set up what is actually the finale of the film, the actual final scene of the film with everybody in the apartment before, well, I should say the final act of the film before the final scene, one-on-one conversation between Spade and Bridget. The bulk of the runtime of the film, and in terms of if you had to look at the actual percentages, this scene here of everyone in the apartment forms about a fifth of the whole runtime of the film. It is a gigantic chunk and played out in these really long takes. This is the culmination of the long take technique and the visual style that has been established throughout the entire film and slowly built up to. So the office scenes and the scenes with Gutman before only build up to this moment when we get all of our players in the scene, capped off here by this beautiful shot of seeing everybody on screen at once and getting reactions from everybody, all staged. And now when we get to the cutaways, each of the characters gets a low angle. Spade gets a low angle. Gutman gets his lower angle when sitting in Spade's own chair. There's a particular bit of extra villainy when things take place in someone's own home. We get the low angle shot of Cairo and his iconic line. And of course, the guns are drawn. But Spade is having to proceed as if none of this matters. And it's his nonchalance, his ability to dance in and around all of the different characters' desires, and his attempts at playing this never-ending chess game. That's what not only fascinates everyone, but it's this chess game that keeps him alive and uncovers the solution of the mystery at the end. If he's not able to maintain this chess game throughout, the whole thing collapses. And this is where his constant baiting of Wilmer finally comes into play, with selecting him as the necessary fall guy. The whole term fall guy, along with referring to Wilmer as a gunzel, these were terms that I think really kind of got popularized by Hammett in this story, and then especially by this film. I think it was this film in particular that helped the idea of the term fall guy and gunzel being used for gunman to enter more of the vernacular. And even though we're cutting back to these same shots of Spade and Gutman, we can see how these moments start to change, how their dispositions start to change. And we can see in Gutman here that while he's saying one thing, we can tell that in order to save himself and get the Falcon, he will do anything, even give up those he claims are like his own son and Wilmer. And we can see Bridget is playing more of the frightened, well, really more of the frightened, quiet type in this scene. That's the particular tack she's chosen. It's not really fooling anyone in particular. We know she is legitimately frightened. And she, like us, the audience, don't know what's going to happen. This is also a nice bit of misdirection, because if you notice, she is off to the side a bit. She is the character, before Wilmer is knocked out, she's the character we see least. But she's also not on our minds as much. We're focused more on the outright, more obvious villainy of Wilmer coming up with the gun coming into frame with the hammer already pulled back, of Gutman and Cairo, but it keeps us focused on them. So when we get to the final scene between Spade and Bridget, the reveal is even more shocking, and we can see just how much of all of her acting in the film so far was indeed an act, and different attempts to try and play Spade himself. The business Laurie does here of leaning over and looking so interested. Then Bogart points to him and smiles, give them Cairo, and then Cairo gets a bit miffed, obviously, and kind of throws it back at him. He gets one line there and does so much with that one line. And then this line here where he gets a little bit angry and his voice raises. Cairo is not a gigantic character in terms of screen time and the amount of dialogue, but again, every single character in this film is larger than life and so memorable because of little moments like that feel so real, and they exist so vividly. And right there we have our three big villains, always kept in a frame together in a sort of triangle pattern and always staging depth. And again, now Spade comes over, he's coming in closer to make his point, and we have the beautiful natural lighting sources that also create depth. And we have depth on the reverse shot by using the back of Spade's head and Bogart's shoulder to give that foreground and to create that splitting of the frame. And you can see all the little facets that Spade is having to think about. You can see the humor in Bogart's eyes, but you can also see the tension. And then you can see as Cairo leans over, then Spade can throw that at Wilmer. It's a constant dance between all these characters. So again, that's why those Gutman scenes earlier are so important. It sets the stage for this scene, where we have everybody with their cards out, or at least we think most of their cards out. More cards start to come out. And then Wilmer goes out, and now we're down one man. And if that wasn't enough, it's Bridget who picks up the gun. And given what happens later, you'd kind of think that maybe she might want to hold on to it. But it's also an attempt at a power play on her part, that she lets Spade take the gun back to give him that sense of, I trust you, you are protecting me. And Spade uses this opportunity to disarm Cairo. So now Spade has played the chess game to be able to finally get one over on everyone and get all the guns in the room. So now he's no longer under physical threat, but he can't ever let his guard down, because if he does, even for a moment, any one of these people may jump him. And now begins the wait. The weight of this scene, of all of the characters having to wait in the same room and allowing the passage of time and allowing bits of natural humanity to come through, is what I think elevates it into the truly memorable and legendary scenes in films. Because it is the scene that most is lived in out of all the scenes in the film. And you get to see more of the set dressing and realize that there is not just a lampshade on that lamp that's being used as natural lighting, but also even a map on the lampshade. So it's something, just an extra little detail to characterize this apartment, which is where Sam Spade lives. So it's, of course, speaking to his character. They have all come into his world. His domain is being violated by their mere presence. So that, again, just adds an extra layer of tension. And now Gutman is starting to throw the various attempts at Spade to try and undercut Miss O'Shaughnessy, as he so wonderfully says everything. And for the first time, he actually gets up to underline his point. And the camera follows him, because Gutman is the key villain. He is the one who drives everything along. He is the greatest danger out of all the villains. So, of course, the camera follows him when he gets up and moves around. And he moves into these incredible shots of depth and perfect staging, where even the same lamp there on the table that has been part of the natural lighting scheme is still creating depth and that sense of space. And we see everything in the background and the doors, and we're just going round and round because we are following the actual action of the scene. The actors are driving the scene, but the camera work is driving the scene at the same time. They're working in unison. And with the sense of depth, we feel as an active participant. We feel like we're sitting there right behind Bridget O'Shaughnessy, and we're here in this little moment in time, and you feel that same electricity and tension as you're sort of chuckling along with Gutman until he drops the bits of humor on certain accenting notes. And of course, this is once again exposition. This is once again telling us things we didn't see. but it's done so beautifully. We can actually picture everything Gutman is saying without ever having to see any of it. So now we know exactly who shot Jacobi and where. It fills in that gap, and it does so in just a short amount of screen time, and it once again serves character. It serves every character in the room, including Wilmer, who is currently passed out. That is the mark of genius, of being able to use exposition to tell 5 character stories, even somebody who is currently unconscious. And notice that it's still these long shots. There are occasionally cut-ins to nice reactive moments that are not quick cutaways either, so it doesn't interrupt the flow of these long shots. But remember, always, the camera's always prowling around, and these are all long, exhausting takes for the actors. And in every single scene, every single shot, they have to maintain the energy. And now getting close-ups of everyone in the room when Wilmer wakes up with no dialogue. And then cutting back to a low shot of both Gutman and Cairo. And we get the iconic, there's only one Maltese Falcon. And then if you look closely, Cairo looks kind of sad, and he puts a hand on Wilmer's shoulder. That's one of the little bits of coding that's in the film that was more explicit in Hammett, that Cairo is a gay character and that he has a certain fondness for Wilmer, and they have a certain, at least a certain developing level of a relationship there. And so you get some little bits of that in the film, but they are coded as to not get really picked up on by the production code. And here is Gutman's ultimate attempt to drive a wedge between Spade and Bridget, of claiming she stole some of the money. In Hammett, Spade actually goes in the kitchen and makes Bridget essentially, he kind of does a strip search of sorts. He doesn't believe her. Here in the film, we don't do that, and we immediately go to Spade suspecting Gutman, which honestly I think is a good change. It was a nice moment in Hammett and showed that Spade still didn't fully trust Bridget, but here this makes Spade look more intelligent, that he sees through the ruse more quickly, and also that he has enough of a connection with Bridget to understand when she is probably telling the truth, and that his gut reactions are indeed correct. And it also allows Gutman to be even more impressed and bemused by this private detective. I've also found it always kind of amusing that Gutman can only raise $10,000. So basically, he's just twice the villainy that Cairo is, who only had a mere $5,000, or so he claimed. And if you look, we still see Cairo reacting to everything that's going on. We can see Wilmer put his head in his hands. And now Gutman is deliciously imparting words of wisdom to Spade, that perhaps Bridget is not what she seems, and that she is quite dangerous, but doing it with such a little duplicitous charm and twinkle in the eye that Spade then calls into the kitchen, and we can hear that new little question in the voice. And that's another important note of changing that bit there, of not having Spade make Bridget essentially do a strip search for the money. It allows Gutman to be impressed with Spade and then be more willing to impart that information that Bridget is more dangerous than she looks. And now look, as Spade is on the phone, we know that he's getting the Falcon delivered. Bridget has come out of the kitchen, come back in. We have this beautiful sensation of depth. All eyes are rooted on Spade, and everyone is almost quivering of sorts. They come closer to him in that moment. And now we have another fade with the passage of time. This is the little moment I was referring to earlier. This here, everybody's sleeping uncomfortably, propped up on chairs. Cairo's going to have a terrible backache. It's the nervous tension is there, but now it's the early morning. The lights coming through the windows. Spade turns off the lights. Gutman has been reading one of Spade's books and is smoking, trying to pass the time. And then Spade sits back down and he takes Bridget's hand as they wait. And all of this is finally cut by the sound of the door buzzer. And now everybody starts to gather together. We can feel Their palms start to get sweaty. The door opens. Gutman follows. And now we have another nice depth shot. And we see Effie. And we finally see some brightness in the scene. And then she's gone. The door closes, and it's all Gutman can do to keep from just grabbing the bundle out of Spade's hands. And now the tension really starts to mount up as the Falcon itself is about to finally be unwrapped and revealed. And then a slight pause. And then the music starts to come in as Gutman starts to tear the paper off. And then right as it starts to be unwrapped, then there's the pause. Now after 17 years. And then we have that extra little beat of time as they all start to look at each other. And then Spade looks at them. In ways he's just as excited and greedy as them, because who wouldn't be? And then the greatest prop in the history of movies is revealed. Looking so serene in its own way, coated in enamel. And then the hands start to touch it as they twist it around and start to observe it. And they just let it sink in that now this great priceless treasure is finally within their hands again. And there in the background, Wilmer gets up. And everyone is paying attention to the Falcon except Spade, who notices that this is when Wilmer makes his exit. And we find that the Falcon itself is only a lead copy from General Kimidov. I so love how the line of Gutman, it's a phony, is off screen, and it almost sounds like it's dubbed in by somebody else because the voice is so intensive. And then here's Laurie's meltdown, which has formed the basis of so many Peter Lorre impressions and my own as well. It's just his standout moment when he goes into complete hysterics at the end of this. And it looks like Gutman's about to literally have a heart attack right then and there. The sweat's just pouring off his face, and he lets out this incredible noise before finally the composure starts to wash back over him. And the outer shell has reassumed itself, and he lets out this incredible laugh. Because in actuality, had it actually been the Falcon, he would have no longer had a quest. And it's the humor of the situation that so delights him. The ingenuity of the Russian amuses him, just as the ingenuity of Sam Spade has amused him this whole time. And he offers Cairo to go along to Istanbul to continue the quest. And the double act between Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre is so magical in this film that one wishes we had gotten a whole series of films about these two going after the Blackbird in film after film. We wish we could see the sequel in Istanbul with them going around. But of course, Warner recognized a good thing when it lasted, when it was there, and so they re-teamed Greenstreet and Lorre in a series of many films, including probably the most famous of them, The Mask of Demetrios. Now, I would be absolutely remiss to not mention the two big names outside of Houston who are the real key players in the success of the Maltese Falcon and why it's so timeless. Of course, the film was produced by Hal B. Wallace, the legendary producer at Warner Brothers, who basically started working as a sort of independent producer at Warner and made the biggest and essentially the more prestige films, but also had a certain stamp of quality in all of his films. But also he could give incredible notes and also micromanage with the best of them. But he had an incredible sense of storytelling and an incredible sense of movies themselves. And so his touch is felt here. But the real secret weapon is Henry Blanke, who is another of the legendary great producers at Warner Brothers. And he was really John Huston's ally and the person that Huston was working with on a daily basis. And Blanke, I think, was the one who sort of ran interference between Huston and the studio and Hal B. Wallace and helped give Huston the basis to enact all his ideas. And so there we have the exit of two of the great villains of cinema with just a bemused, charming wave and a bidding of adieu. And of course, the rare Avis left on the table. Spade shares a light smile with Bridget there. One last little bit of misdirection, or that perhaps things are going to work out fine for these two, and they do seem to really care for one another. But we can start to see that Bridget is starting to question things. She backs away. We go into this reaction shot. From that same shot, there is no cut. We can see the wheels turning in her head. We can see her look at Spade in a different way, and it's a completely different countenance. So again, it's an incredibly multifaceted performance. It's so many different layers. And this is the final confrontation. This is the iconic moment where all the cards are put on the table, everything is dropped, and you can see Bridget try every single trick she has in her bag of tricks, and none of them work. You can see she tries everything, and you can see that maybe she actually does care about Spade, and maybe Spade does care about her. But ultimately, Spade's code is his existence, and his code is literally himself. He is his code. He cannot possibly go along with her. And this is the absolute point. If you were not convinced before, if you were seeing Bogart's filmography in chronological order, if you were not convinced before in this film, in every single frame, that Bogart was an icon here, and this for me is his most iconic role. This is what cemented his stardom forever. This conclusion is the ultimate moment of his iconic status in this film, because he modulates between anger, frustration, energy, the feeling of being used and manipulated, and recognizing every single different facet and thing and element that Bridget has used and played him on this entire time. She has played him and manipulated him. But Spade is the first person she has encountered who not only recognizes all of this and is able to piece everything together, but also won't give in to her charms, even though all of him wants to. And what's most fascinating about Bogart's performance in this scene is the self-loathing, of the resignation, of, again, the idea of the job is the life is the job. And outside of that, what else really is there? And then you can see the dawning, just the actual dawning on Bridget's face. And even at this point, she still can't quite believe it. And because these scenes are playing out in the same room we've been in, and now everybody's gone, and we know the police are on the way, we know there's a ticking clock, and we know this has to be resolved before they get there. And if we're at all invested in this relationship between these two, and you are, especially the first time, you are every time, but we know that something has to happen. And you know what Bridget has done, and you know all the terrible things she's done over the course of the film, and you know that she killed Miles Archer now. But you have to hope that things are still going to turn out well. You do have a hope for these characters, but you know that she's duplicitous as hell, and you know that she's lied her head off. And the key line, of course, is, "I won't play the sap for you." And notice how Spade comes in close and goes away. He's trying to break this connection to her, but he can't quite do it. And he knows he'll never quite be able to do it. And this is what he's grappling with. This is what they're both grappling with. They're grappling with the fact that they have developed a connection to one another, and it's caused them to be slightly off their game a little bit. And of course, it's going to mean that Spade actually figures out who killed Miles Archer and be able to give the police the proper summation of things. But it means, of course, Bridget's imprisonment or possible execution. And if that was not dramatic enough, here is the most fascinating part. The decision to have Bogey sit down and play it this moment in his inimitable way, and to have Houston focus on this, of Spade recounting this as if he's narrating to himself. He's telling himself what has to happen. He's telling himself the rules of the world that he knows are written down in his own very soul. And he's almost reciting this with no emotion in his face. He's reciting this to Bridget to explain the codes of conduct that she obviously does not understand, comprehend, or even know exist. And of course, he's having to contain the seething emotions inside, and she knows that. And he knows that she knows that. And he knows that he's not doing a very good job of hiding it, but he has to do it anyway. So all of this adds up to the fact that still, up until the very last moment, you don't know if Spade is going to hand Bridget in. And once again, this is accentuated by the depth of the staging in the room and how defeated they look. And now it's daylight and they've been in this room all this time and they're exhausted and they're tired and they haven't slept all night. So their nerves are on edge. They've been on edge for hours. And again, going into these longer takes are exhausting, and that plays into the performances. So it all goes back to Huston's design, his conception, the visual design with Arthur Edison, the natural lighting, the depth of every shot, and how there's a sense of deeper focus and staging. But getting everybody to this point where we're all feeling this tension right up until the door buzzer sounds. And that moment holds, and we see Spade from behind. In that same shot, he says, "Come in," and the way he says it, we know then and there that he's handing her over, and that is underlined by the staging of this shot when the cops come in, and the way everyone's standing stock still, and now Bridget knows her fate, and you see how Astor is standing erect and rigid, and she's already now realizing what has happened. We even get one final joke at Dundee's expense. But that's just a fleeting moment of levity for Spade, because he knows he has, technically done the right thing, but it's not the thing he wanted to do. But it is the only thing he could do. And then here, Tom picks up the bird, doesn't understand the significance, and we have what is the greatest ad-lib in all of motion picture history. Whether it was Bogart, as is often reported, or Huston, or somebody else, it's most likely Bogart, quoting or referencing a line from Shakespeare's The Tempest, "the stuff that dreams are made of." Now, this replaced Hammett's ending. They were originally going to shoot Hammett's ending of Back in the Office with Iva Archer originally coming in, but everyone realized that that would have been just a bit too much, that by ending here and adding an extra shot or two, it was the perfect conclusion to the more mythic rendering of all of these characters in the 1941 version of the Maltese Falcon. And of course, we end on a final shot of the Blackbird itself, whose mere presence haunts this entire story and every single one of the characters who will never forget the Blackbird. So I want to thank you for sitting through the 1941 third version of the Maltese Falcon from Warner Brothers, the immortal masterpiece based on Dashiell Hammett's original novel, one of the most iconic films ever made, and the absolute majestic directorial debut, also written by the incredible legend John Huston. So, as always, I hope my comments have been at least somewhat fun and informative and have helped you look more closely at the Maltese Falcon. And hopefully this will encourage you to make many repeat visits to San Francisco and once again take up the quest for the Blackbird in order to hopefully better understand the never-ending allure and mystery of the Maltese Falcon. As always, I am humbly yours, the motion picture analyst,